today. Thank you. And we are recording this. I know there's one person who was going to come a little late. And if you end up needing to share this with a colleague, we will have the recording in the Google folder. The people helping us today from the NERRS Science Collaborative are Nick Soberall and Jane Ballard, who work with the reserve system managing grants to the reserves and managing our grant for this project. Trying to advance my slides. Let's see if I'm. There we go. So the official name of this project, which we affectionately call Marshes for Maine's Future, is Collaborative Science to Support Marsh Conservation and Management Decisions in Maine. And as I said, the NERRS Science Collaborative, we've got two members of that organization, Nick and Jane, on the call today, funded the project, which runs from October 23 to September of 24. We have two main objectives, and this is for the new people on the call who haven't been with us in previous webinars. Number one, we want to improve the capacity of Maine managers and some folks who aren't in Maine to conserve and manage marshes by linking their existing expertise to new data products. So it's building on the extreme amount of expertise you guys already bring to this. And then we also have a side objective of demonstrating best practices for how you create and transfer, in this case, the USGS coastal wetland synthesis products to the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. So we're doing a project within a project. There's two tools that we use on this project that we're introducing to marsh managers: the Restoration Decision Matrix and the Marsh Lifespan Calculator. Those are the two USGS tools that are the focus of this project. And as you know, about 9 of you completed the survey that we did, the Marshes for Maine's Future survey, which is linked here. And you've identified the marsh issues you're working in and the specific locations where you would like to work on a case study. And let me ask Judy kind of in real time, is it possible for people to still do that survey if they haven't done it, Judy?
Yes.
Okay, good. And we'll get the link back out. If there are others who didn't complete the survey and want to get your information in that, we'll resend the link for you. But you can go and see what all the partners on this grant have entered. And actually, the backstory is that a group of us spent last year, from last fall to spring, preparing the grant. So the grant did not come out of my head. It came out of the heads of the marsh manager colleagues that you all work with every day. So here's what our objectives are today. We're going to share information with you about the science that underpins the practitioner-focused restoration decision matrix and Marsh Lifespan Calculator. You don't need to know this in an academic way. These are tools for practitioners who are out in the marsh managing them in the real world. And so you're going to apply these two tools to your marsh management case study, and we'll talk more about that as well. A second objective for today is that you will know the location of potential case studies in southern Maine, where we'll have some data for you to practice with this winter. And during the winter period, you'll be able to work with the data in southern Maine case studies. Objective number 3 is that when you explore the data this winter, during the period from now till the week of January 22nd, you'll be able to try the two tools in places that you're familiar with. Now, don't worry if your primary case study is something that's outside of southern Maine. We're just going to practice with the local data in the winter. And Neil will say more about the timetable and why we're just using southern Maine data, and later the entire state data will be available for the final case studies. We're going to select a January date the week of January 22nd. I'll be sending you a when to meet. Someday during that week, we're going to have another meeting like this one for you to share your experiences of practicing with the data this winter. And then also we've had a session accepted in the Maine Sustainability and Water Conference for March 28th. At the end of the meeting, I'm going to ask you guys if any of you are willing to help me by presenting your marsh work in this session in the water conference. I'll be presenting about this project, but we want to get stories from you all about your own work in marshes in Maine. So that'll be to wrap up the meeting. Now I'm going to stop sharing. Now I can see everybody who's here. And any questions about the intro and the overview? I'm kind of setting the stage. I don't want to repeat too much for the people that either watched the videos or lived the experience of October 4th, but any questions? You can either come off mute or raise your hand. All right, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Neil to dig into the science of these tools that we're going to use. Thank you all for being here today. This is great to see you.
All right, thank you, Chris. And I'm Neil Ganji, oceanographer at the USGS in Woods Hole. I know several of you have seen a lot of this material, so I thought I would do something slightly different for the science intro. So I'm going to keep it very, very informal. So feel free to interrupt me. But I wanted to tell the story of how these metrics came about, and less from a scientific perspective and more from an actual kind of thought process of how these ideas got started and where they came from. So I started working at the USGS in 2001 in California, and my task then was to measure carbon and sediment fluxes to a wetland in San Francisco Bay. And at that point, the idea had nothing to do with marsh vulnerability, had nothing to do with geomorphology. It was about carbon reacting with disinfectant byproducts at the water treatment plants in the Bay Delta area, and that creating trihalomethanes, which are carcinogens. If I remember correctly, it was a long time ago, but that's what I remember the project was about. And that was 20 whatever years ago. And then when I got to Woods Hole about 8 years after that, so 15 years ago, I was working on inner shelf sediment transport modeling. So nothing to do with marshes at all, completely open coast, waves and tides and models. And shortly thereafter, I went to a workshop on inner shelf modeling, but it had people who were working on the marshes behind the barrier islands, and Don Cahoon and Glenn Guttensbergen, who are USGS Marsh folks, were there. And they asked me some questions specifically about this plot on the left. So this plot is from one of Matt Kerwin's papers where they were looking at a bunch of different models. And this was kind of before some of the models that folks use now, but I think this was kind of early versions of the MEM model and the Warmer model and the Crone model. But basically they were trying to model whether or not marshes would keep up with sea level rise, and trying to show that what mattered was the sea level rise rate and the sediment concentration. And so that's what you see on the Y and the X axes here. And then each of these lines is just a different tide range. So I think this is big tide range. No, I'm sorry, this is low tide range. This is medium tide range. This is high tide range. And if you're on the bottom side of this curve, you would be still marsh. And if you're on the other side, you would convert to subtidal habitat based on where you are on this Y and X axis. Now I saw this, and I had a fit, because I said there's no way that's how you would predict marsh vulnerability based on some static number of sediment concentration, because I came from sediment transport, and I know that sediment transport is more complicated than just one number. But this was the state of the art at the time. And shortly after, Matt Kerwin and Glenn Guttensbergen had a similar paper here on the right that was now spatially explicit. And this is kind of the same thing you see on the left, but expanded over a marsh platform. And moving from top to bottom is tide range. So again, these are, I think, like 0.5 meter tide range. The middle is 1 meter tide range, and the bottom panel are 3 meter tide ranges. And then moving from left to right is sea level rise. So in the top right here, you have small tide range marshes and high sea level rise rates. So the marshes completely converted to open water. And then here at the bottom left, you have high tide range and low sea level rise, and the marsh is completely intact. And then even with high sea level rise, a marsh with large tide range, so what you get in Maine, manages to stay intact and build elevation capital through biomass production because of large tide range. Now, one thing I want you to see here is those of you who have seen me talk about the UVVR, the unvegetated-vegetated ratio, that wasn't even on my radar when I was looking over these papers, but you can see just from this graphic, the UVVR is in here, right? So this marsh up here has a UVVR of infinity. This marsh here, assuming that the yellow parts are vegetated, that's a UVVR of probably about 2. And then I would say that this UVVR, in this case up here in the top middle panel, that's probably a UVVR of about 0.15, which is our tipping point we like to talk about. So even back then, 13 years ago, the UVVR was already being shown in work, just not in that context. So after this stuff, I went back to the source and did a lot of reading of historical papers that are still relevant today. So obviously Redfield's paper on the Barnstable area marsh from 1972 talks a lot about sediment transport, very indirectly, but in a very coherent way. So just a couple of the ideas that Redfield talks about. So he talks about here erosive processes that are destroying the marsh. And that's kind of shown in this image where you've got marsh blocks slumping off into the channel. He talks about eroded banks allowing sediment to get trapped behind it, and then vegetation growing back out even after a marsh has collapsed a little bit. And then again, about the blocks of peat breaking off from the margin falling into the channel. So he's talking about sediment transport. He's talking about geomorphic change in a 3-dimensional context. The thing he doesn't say explicitly is sea level rise. So nowhere in this paper does he talk about persistent sea level rise. Now, if there was no sea level rise, the processes he's talking about here would maintain the marsh in its current format, because you would have a block slump off, vegetation would grow behind it. If there's no sea level rise, it would just kind of maintain its equilibrium configuration. With sea level rise, however, you need a new input of sediment in order to keep up with that erosive process. And then the other foreshadowing of the UVVR back in 72 was the imagery that Redfield or someone in his lab digitized of the open water and marsh plain, which was in the image of his paper. So even then he was thinking about the UVVR indirectly as well. All right, so again, implicit in what Redfield is talking about is this idea of withdrawals in the sediment budget and deposits. So, when a marsh slumps over, it kind of breaks off a chunk, and that chunk can erode and end up in the channel, and it could be exported out of the channel. And that would be a withdrawal from your marsh's sediment budget. On the other hand, you can have deposition on your marsh plain from the channel. You can have deposition on the mudflat and then growth of vegetation, as he pointed out, and you can see it here. And this is actually from a gunkwit, this channel here. And then you can get deposition in the channel. So there's all these complex processes that are happening that are either withdrawing sediment from your budget or adding sediment to your budget. And the work that we've done, as well as others, and this plot here on the right from Sergio Fagrazzi shows this as well, shows that if you have a net input of sediment overall, you're going to have marsh expansion. And if you have a net output, you're going to have marsh erosion. And what that depends on is the relative sea level rise rate where you are and whether or not that marsh can keep up. And that's what this plot here is very similar to the one that was in the Kerwin paper, except this is now spatially explicit and accounting for an actual sediment budget. The other thing to note here is in all of these models they did, marshes are rarely in equilibrium. They're always either expanding or eroding. And that's something we should keep in mind when we're thinking about marsh sustainability and restoration. There is no real equilibrium for a salt marsh. So what we wanted to do then was combine all those ideas together and measure actual sediment budgets to marshes. And so again, going back to that workshop with Don Cahoon and Glenn Gunsbergen, and working with Matt Kerwin, they said, can you measure the sediment transport out of one of our sites? And I said, well, we can definitely try. So we went to the most unstable wetland, I would say in the United States, probably, if not, well, certainly on the East Coast. I probably shouldn't say that when the Gulf is where it's at. But Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge is the site they were working at. And so they had been obviously observing, decades of marsh loss here, as well as subsidence and lack of vertical accretion, and wanted to know what the sediment budget was. So we went out to measure those parameters at a couple of sites at Blackwater, and then we chose a stable site just to the east of it. So these places are basically touching each other. They're only separated by, the undegraded part of wetland right here. The Blackwater area is drained through the Blackwater River, whereas the Fishing Bay site is coming off this other river, the Transquaking. So we wanted to do kind of a comparative study of these two. And again, the UVVR is something that was obvious in pictures that Fish and Wildlife was taking decades ago. So even back in 1938, this portion of Blackwater, which was photographed using aerial imagery, this already had a UVVR well above 0.5. I think I digitized this once, and I think it was about 0.8. And so already it was past a tipping point. And whether the cause was nutria, the tidal restriction of the road, lack of sediment, subsidence, whatever it was already on a trajectory of decline back in 1938. And you can see by 1989 and then present, UVVR approaching infinity as there's almost no vegetated plain left. So what we did is we went out with these instruments and over several months measured the sediment budget. I don't want you to spend much time thinking about this other than to show that we put instruments in the water. We collect a lot of water samples, which is what you see in this. This is 116 water samples to calibrate suspended sediment to turbidity. These are cross-sectional surveys of water flux and sediment through the channels. And we do that at a couple of sites. And what you're seeing on the bottom right panel here is suspended sediment flux. So this is the sediment budget on a tidal timescale. And so you have to sum this up to get the net sediment budget. But what I want to show you here is the red line is Blackwater, the unstable part of the marsh, and the black line is Fishing Bay, which was the stable area. Positive numbers are actually flux outs, and these gray lines are all storms, or actually this is a non-storm period. But all of these are big storms with winds from the northwest, and the Blackwater area is losing sediment here, it's losing sediment here, losing sediment here, losing sediment here. So what we were able to show is that big storms were resuspending sediment, eroding marsh plain, sending water out of Chesapeake Bay and out of the Blackwater area, and that was causing massive sediment export and ongoing marsh loss at Blackwater. So we did that at these two sites, and then we said, well, we need more than 2 points. So we had 2 data points. One was big sediment input, one was a big sediment output. So we had some other sites around the country, 2 in California, the 2 I already mentioned, a couple in New Jersey, and then one in Algonquin, and then another one from the literature. So we did the same study, put the instruments out over several months, collected a lot of water samples, measured the sediment budget. And what you're seeing in the colors here are the creek sheds behind each measurement location. So for example, at Point Magoo, our instrument was right here above the U, and so we're measuring the fluxes from this creek shed. And so what's in orange here is vegetated, and what's in blue is unvegetated. Same goes for all these. Algonquin, for whatever reason, got yellow and baby or lavender for its unvegetated. So when we did that, we wanted to find some kind of unifying metric that was independent of the sediment budget that could account for vulnerability. And after thinking about the papers of Matt Kerwin, Redfield's papers, all of the work that's been done, if you have vegetated plain, you're going to be intact, you're going to be trapping sediment. If you don't have vegetated plain, you're going to be losing sediment and not able to trap more sediment. And the data bore that out. So on the y-axis here are the net sediment budgets from those 8 complexes. And then on the x-axis is the unvegetated-vegetated marsh ratio of each area, or the UVVR. And so obviously the first thing is you can see is every site was in a deficit. And this accounts for sea level rise in it. So this is the measured sediment minus the sea level rise deficit. So Fishing Bay was our most resilient site, nearly in equilibrium, which doesn't exist, as I said earlier. And then Blackwater is down here at a UVVR close to 1 and was losing, gosh, I think it was a kilogram per second of sediment, and it equates to 1 kilogram per square meter per year of black water. And the other thing to point out here is this tipping point. Our data in this study showed it was somewhere around 0.1. Now, when we wrote this, we wanted to find other examples to kind of justify that the UVVR meant something geomorphically. So one of the first things was a separate modeling study from a group in the Venice Lagoon that had a coupled model of sediment transport and plant dynamics. And this was done before our study. And so here on the y-axis, they have sea level rise increasing in this direction, sediment concentration increasing in this direction. Their most stable case, so this is the lowest sea level rise and the highest sediment input, basically came out to a UVVR of 0.13. And our plot that we just showed was 0.10. Their worst UVVR up here with the highest sea level rise and lowest sediment was 0.35. So we brought this into the paper to say, okay, there's other evidence for marshes wanting to come to some kind of optimal UVVR when they're not stressed by sea level and they're not stressed by sediment deficits. And so this paper gave us a 0.13. Other modeling studies from Julia Mariotti at LSU had similar behavior, showing that with low sea level rise, so down here, and high sediment input, any ponds that form within marshes, which in Maine we have several of these, if ponds form and open up to channels, they can recover in a cyclical process, whereas if sediment input is low and sea level rise is high, they will drown. And then the last piece of evidence was something that wasn't even talked about in the paper, and I was a co-author on the paper, but I didn't notice it until a couple of years later. So Kirsten Wasson worked with us to compare several marsh parcels across the country. And so we did like a side-by-side across, I think, 5 or 6 systems where we picked a degrading marsh and an intact marsh and compared all kinds of metrics from the NERRS. And so they were all in Kirsten's paper, but we did image analysis of decadal UVVR. So UVVR now and the UVVR from 10 years prior. And we barely talked about it. And I can't remember if this plot was in the paper. It might have been in there, or we might have just mentioned it, but what we saw was basically if you're at a UVVR of below 0.15, and that was basically 4 or 5 of the sites, your UVVR didn't change much in a decade. If you're above 0.15, you kind of went on runaway open water expansion. So this is Elkhorn Slough out here. One of these is probably Terrebonne. One of these is Blackwater. But basically, once you cross a threshold, you go into runaway open water expansion. So that's why the UVVR metric of about 0.15 is something that we have been using extensively, is because it's telling you about a tipping point where a marsh can no longer trap sediment and starting to lose sediment and head into a runaway open water expansion. All right, so I'm going to stop there. If there's any questions, that's all the philosophy and background that I want to talk about. Everything here on out is going to be some technical stuff about the data we're going to be showing. So I'll stop there for a sec. Going once, going twice, okay. So once we had the justification for this UVVR, we decided to map it across the Northeast. And so this is the work that Kate has been doing throughout the Northeast region, and she's just completed a preliminary data set for all of Maine and has to do some QA/QC, but I'll be showing that to you at the end here. And so what we do is we take the National Wetlands Inventory as our first mask for emergent wetlands, and we delineate them into marsh units using CONED elevation data or LiDAR data, and basically breaking each marsh into individual creek sheds. So just like we did in that 2017 paper, we're trying to constrain each marsh into its own little drainage area. And then we use NAIP imagery, which is at 1 meter resolution, to classify unvegetated and vegetated areas. And then we aggregate those values up to get a UVVR value for each marsh unit, which is what we call these polygons. So anything in the light green or below is kind of below that threshold of 0.15 around, and anything that's white or above is above that. So for instance, you can see these white and pink parcels right here. If I go back, you'll see they have significant open water. Some of it is channelization, but some of it is actual ponding and open water expansion. All right. So we did that across the Northeast a few years ago with the Park Service, and I just want to show what that translates to for the decision matrix, which you're going to see here in a minute. So we make these marsh units, and this is across 4 estuaries here shown on the left. This is Plum Island here, about 1,000 units, if I remember correctly. And so across each unit, we can quantify not just the UVVR, which you see here on the right, but also elevation metrics from those LiDAR and CONET data. So we can get the mean elevation of the parcel. We can also get the elevation of just the vegetated part of the parcel, and then relative to NAVD88, as well as mean sea level. So obviously that's a useful metric. Even with the error that we know comes from LiDAR and marshes, these still give you a very good relative picture of low elevation and high elevation. Now, when we compared those 4 estuaries, one of the first things we saw is they all kind of collapsed to the same relationship, and they all showed a tipping point in elevation UVVR of about 0.1, basically suggesting that every one of these complexes had the same distribution of UVVR relative to elevation, with half of the units being above the mean elevation and below UVVR of 0.1, and half being below that elevation and above 0.1. So again, we're seeing this kind of consensus. There's something happening at that tipping point of about 0.1 to 0.15. Now, when I made this plot, I was really happy and like, all right, we're done. But then I started wondering about all these little gray points, which you probably can't see, but there's all these outliers. So, there's a point over here that's really high elevation, but it's got a UVVR of 1. And my curiosity got the better of me, and I wanted to know what is going on in those parcels. And so that got me to this decision matrix. So I came to the realization that, okay, not everything is going to fall into this really neat categorization of vertically, resilient and laterally intact, or vertically vulnerable and laterally deteriorating. There are exceptions or even rules about why marshes might be on other ends of the spectrum. So that came up, so that brought me to this, and just basically classifying all of our marsh units based on their elevation and their UVVR. So the idea would be, if I've got a high elevation parcel and it's intact, there's nothing I need to do other than protect it or facilitate potential migration if it's up against a landward boundary. If it's intact, but it's low in elevation, again, not a heck of a lot you could do restoration-wise, but you could certainly monitor closely to see if you do have open water conversion or more rapid elevation loss, or you could look at potential causes of why that marsh might be low elevation due to tidal restrictions or sediment deficits or something along those lines. Here in the bottom right, probably what we're all most familiar with are low elevation marshes that are falling apart laterally. And those are situations where you have to decide whether or not the means are there to restore that parcel, or whether it's best to do nothing because it's not worth the cost and it's not feasible. And then lastly, the most interesting category, the restoration category. So these are marshes that have high elevation vegetated plains, but have a lot of open water. And so maybe these are candidates for sediment augmentation, runneling, facilitating revegetation, because you already have significant elevation capital of the remaining vegetated plain. And this was the first imagery I did where I tried to pick those parcels out. And these are all from Great South Bay, New York. And so again, low UVVR, high elevation right up against the forested boundary, great candidate for acquisition of that property. A low elevation marsh that's intact right on a tidal channel. This is one you'd want to keep a close eye on. And again, it's also next to a forested boundary. Here are some marshes that are back barrier behind Fire Island. So there's quite a bit of open water. These could be candidates for runneling to kind of allow those unvegetated areas to revegetate. And then lastly, a parcel in Great South Bay with the classic, waffle syrup thing going on, where really, unless there's some critical species using these, trying to restore them might not be feasible given the cost and location. All right, and lastly, the lifespan. We're only going to spend a little bit of time on this because it's a concept that is really simple, but for whatever reason, sometimes it has to be done on paper to really show people how simple it is. But I'm actually going to skip the equation and I'm going to go straight to the image. So this is my cartoon guy on his marsh island checking his SET after he's lost all his marsh. It's not relevant about the cartoon other than it's a good illustration of lifespan method. So in the lifespan method, we are accounting for all the sediment that's above sea level in the vegetated plain. So everything this guy is sitting on that's above, that you can see here in brown, that's above the water line, and we're assuming this is mean sea level, we take that massive sediment. So that's simply the volume times the density. So that gives us mass. So we have to make some guess at density. But we get the volume from the area and the elevation of the vegetated plain. So pretty straightforward there. It's mass. Then there are two ways to have a deficit and an export of sediment. One is sea level rise. So very simply, sea level rise is putting a vertical deficit. So let's say it's 5 millimeters per year. That's a vertical distance times the area of the whole complex. So not just the vegetated part, but the whole complex. And that gives you a volume of area, a volume of space that the marsh wants to fill with sediment in order to stay in equilibrium. Okay, so again, with the density, that volume can get converted to a mass. So now you have a mass deficit per year that the marsh needs to accumulate and bring in or cannibalize from itself to keep up with sea level rise. And then the second way you can lose sediment is from that runaway open water expansion. So as you increase the UVVR, you tend to export more sediment. And that's that relationship in that curve of the net sediment budget versus the UVVR. So basically, there's two ways to lose sediment, and you have one balance in your account. And so you divide those two numbers and you get a time scale. And conceptually, what this is telling you is how long do I have before the massive sediment that's in brown here that this guy's sitting on has to get spread out over my entire complex, including the subtidal areas, to keep up with sea level rise. So it's a very simple mass balance. I'm constantly being asked about the uncertainty. And the fact is there's no uncertainty in the mass balance. The uncertainty is in the inputs. So what we put in for elevation of the marsh plain, what we put in for density, what we put in for the sea level rise rate, those are the terms that give you uncertainty. The actual calculation is just a simple mass balance. So one of the things we're working on in a separate project is doing elevation uncertainty and rolling that into lifespan uncertainty. And I'll be showing you a little bit of the lifespan today. All right. And now I'm really stopping for questions. And if there are none, I'm going to wait even longer.
So Neil, this is Chris. I have a question. So is thin layer placement basically adding things into the mass balance?
Exactly. So if you have a marsh unit, let's say that is relatively far away from where your sediment is coming from a reuse project. So let's say it's coming from a channel inlet, to the entrance to a marsh complex, and the Corps got their dredge, a kilometer in, and they've got a pipe running a few kilometers or a kilometer over to a marsh parcel. If they're putting that sediment into that unit, that is a addition to your sediment budget, to your balance. So you're basically doing a one-time infusion of cash into your account. And that's something that we account for in the lifespan calculator, which I'll be showing in a minute. So
okay, and so what you would show us in a minute is maybe how you could use these tools to determine whether where to put the sediment in a thin layer placement experiment.
I'm going to do a lot of different things here. One is where.
Yeah.
And as I'll say in the caveats in a minute here, I'm not telling anybody, I'm not giving any advice here. These are all very hypothetical. But yes, where, which is qualitative and based on feasibility, right? And then once selected, what massive sediment is going to get you what kind of restoration target? And these are questions that we had in the survey about being able to assess restoration success and setting targets. And while the lifespan calculator and what I just showed is super simple, I do believe it might be the most simple and most reliable way to really use what numbers are, what numbers you have that are spatially explicit to get a concrete estimate of benefit in terms of years. So we'll be talking about that in a minute here.
Okay. And Jake, you had a question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Can we go back to the decision matrix slide? Okay, my question was going to be what the threshold for high versus low elevation. Can you talk, I think you've probably talked about this before. Can you just talk quickly about where that number comes from?
Absolutely. So this example is from Chesapeake Bay and largely arbitrary when we picked this one. And when we handed this matrix off to the state of Maryland, what we told them is, in practice, there's a couple ways you can do it. One would be to pick a region you're working in and pick the median elevation of, because we have the elevation data in the marsh units, right? So they could, draw a line or a polygon around all the units they're interested in, find the median elevation and use that as a threshold. That's one option. Option two is to move the threshold around to get a acreage of one of these boxes. So let's say the state decides, all right, we've got the bandwidth or we have a mandate to facilitate migration for 30% of our wetland units. They could move these thresholds around until they get 30% of their acreage in the dark purple color there. Or if they say, all right, we've got the money and the mandate to do 10,000 acres of restoration, they could tweak the thresholds to get 10,000 acres in the beige and red. So that's what we've recommended. For the cases I'm going to show for Maine in a minute here, Kate and I picked an arbitrary threshold last night at 5 p.m. and we picked 1.25 meters because your marshes in Maine are exceedingly high, which is great. And 1.25 looked like something like the median. Now, if we're going to do this coming up to the next workshop, we would probably pick the median over some large area, or use feedback from the rest of y'all about where you see marshes kind of transitioning from stable to unstable based on elevation.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I was just thinking that it would be interesting having picked an elevation, and I imagine you could also pick that based off of some type of observed value for vegetation communities, let's say, that you're interested in. But having done that, obviously you could then take this and spatially quantify the number of marsh units that fall into each one of these boxes, which I think would also be interesting.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and yeah, it's a great question. What you'll see when I show the main example is we've probably picked a relatively low threshold at 1.25 because there's a lot of beige and red in our maps, but it's fine for demonstration purposes today. All right, any other questions? Great Bay NERR. Okay,
Hi.
Chris Peters.
Sorry, I was hiding. Great talk. I was like hearing you talk, Neil. Just to follow up on this like matrix here, and I'll preface I'm a little bit of a troublemaker, so I'm gonna stir some trouble here. But I saw a nice talk at Surf. I saw you give a talk as well, and some of your colleagues, and one of them that kind of got me thinking was in Massachusetts they're looking at tidal restrictions and looking at UVVR, and they got a pattern of a lower UVVR with tidal restrictions, and I was kind of thinking, would that fall more in that teal category, like that lower elevation, the low UVVR, and maybe it's just kind of a time bomb that's waiting to be more U and less V with sea level rise, but we still have low elevation. So just kind of curious how to be, like we're looking at tidal restrictions in Maine, New Hampshire, Mass. I wonder if it's really mostly in that teal bucket.
Yeah, you're not making any kind of trouble. That's exactly right. I mean, I think we see that at numerous sites where Phragmites is, dense and proliferating behind restrictions. And so the actual, bare earth elevation is quite low. UVVR is quite low. And again, I think that's why I like the investigate potential causes in here. And I'm going to be talking about that a little later, where I think Phragmites, for example, comes in early on in this matrix. where it's mapped, it should go into this matrix as another axis, or, you know, take over perhaps the, you know, maybe you get rid of the elevation axis and put Phragmites cover, or vice versa. I think, yeah, and I think the other thing is there are some places, and like you said, not so much in the Northeast, but certainly in the Mid-Atlantic, where tidal restrictions tend to have a higher UVVR behind them. But maybe that's more because of sediment deficits. But yeah, in the Northeast, the signature that I see most often when I'm looking, you know, parcel by parcel, is behind the restrictions, you tend to actually have pretty dense vegetative cover, and a low UVVR. So absolutely, I agree with your assessment there.
Great, thanks. And I'll cause trouble later if I didn't cause trouble now. So I'll hold
Sure.
that for later.
Appreciate it. Go ahead. I didn't see whose hand was up first, but I'll just.
Yeah, Jeremy, go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Neil. I'm also curious about some of those ones that might probably fall in that teal bucket. So there's a few marsh units that I'm thinking of in particular that are fit that classic low marsh profile. And in some of them where we have done a little bit of short-term sedimentation work, you know, it shows that, as you would expect, those low marsh areas are creating more sediment, or sediment at a higher rate than the higher marsh areas. And so I just thinking about the difference in tidal range in Maine, and how there's like a difference in accretion rates between those two different marsh types, if it's worth thinking about having two thresholds where there may be a threshold that, like, you get to a certain elevation and a certain sea level rise scenario, and that area persists as low marsh potentially for a long period of time without ever actually getting enough elevation to build a high marsh platform. Is that something that fits in the model that you're looking at, or how do you think about areas like that with regard to the one fixed tipping point for elevation?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I completely understand. So you're basically saying, well, what you're saying is you got the low marshes that, because they're stressed and they're low on the tide frame, are able to accrete more,
Right,
and kind of rapidly accrete, even though they're still maybe not keeping up with sea level rise, while the high ones are not accreting, but are still have so much elevation capital that they will persist longer.
well, I guess I'm just wondering, like, is there a way to, like, the tidal range in which that low marsh exists is a fairly wide window in Maine. And so is there a way that the model captures areas that are, you know, it's not that high marsh platform, it's supporting marsh habitat. A lot of these areas are kind of sloping. I can envision a scenario where over time it never gets up to high marsh habitat. But it captures enough sediment to stay at that kind of a low marsh elevation relative to sea level rise over time.
Right.
And I guess I'm just, I'm thinking about some of the restoration techniques that we're looking at, and a lot of them involve taking areas that are open water and then hoping that they recolonize in alterniflora, which is going to increase your sedimentation rate. But I could also see a scenario where you do that, and instead of reforming a marsh platform, you capture more sediment, but it never becomes high marsh. It just sort of stays like.
Right.
Is that something? Yeah.
Yeah, I have to think about that. I kind of see what you're getting at. I don't think we have the processes to account for that in any of these tools. But I'm wondering if that's simply something that you parameterize with the elevation, the current elevation, and the sea level rise rate. Like there might already be models out there to predict that I don't know about. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't think I have a good answer for that. Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Great talk. Always learn a lot listening to your synthesis of data. Really interesting. My question, and maybe this is building a little bit off of what Jeremy was talking about, is all vegetation created equal? So if you're creating these ratios, or this particular ratio, and you described a little bit in the methodology how you're using imagery and mapping it and quantifying that. But in my experience, it seems like there's probably vegetation communities or cohorts of vegetation that are better at trapping and accumulating sediment than others. And so does that weigh into your model at all? Or are you just looking at if it's green, it's vegetated, and you're going with that? And maybe that's a more complicated question to answer right now, but just wanted to get your initial thoughts.
No, I think you've got it. And I think what you'll see in the examples I'm going to show coming up here is that these two metrics are just a starting point. What we need to do is bring in vegetative communities. We need to bring in forest marsh slope. We need to bring in, development pressure. So these are just a starting point. And, I think the vegetative community one is certainly an important one, specifically, obviously, for Phragmites versus not Phragmites. What I wonder about, and we've had this discussion with other stakeholders, for example, in the Southern Atlantic Bight, is we have to keep in mind there's a difference in what we can predict. There's a difference in what we can produce right now in terms of a map of something and present state. So like right now, in theory, there are methods to go out with a drone, right? And get close to mapping what's Phrag, what's Spartina, what's, Disticlus, whatever, right? There are ways to do that. There is no way to predict that into the future at that resolution. You could maybe do probabilistic maps based on elevation and salinity at a 30-meter resolution, maybe. But there's a difference between current state and predicted. So I just want to make that statement first. So what I would say is, if we're just dealing with present day and trying to identify priorities and techniques, then absolutely we need to bring in present day vegetative cover maps to have some idea of what we're trying to restore and where we think it might go. But I don't think we have the capability of actually modeling what that distribution will look like in the future. I think that anybody who says they have that is lying.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Kristen?
Yeah, hi. I just was going to go back to what Jeremy was asking about with how it might be variable, or how the numbers might be variable across a marsh system. And I was wondering something similar, but then it made me have the question of whether the elevation. So you were saying with the creek sheds, you were assigning a UVVR kind of rolled up into a creek shed, and that's how it ends up being mapped out. And so would this matrix also be rolling up an elevation within the same creek shed so that they're automatically, okay. So I think maybe some of that would get some of what Jeremy was asking, or at least what I was asking, would be solved, because that elevation does change away from the source of sediment and, either inland or upstream. And so it may be expressed in this matrix, at least at the course level anyway.
Yes. Yeah. At the marsh unit level, let's say you're moving in a gradient from, let's say at like, Wells or what do you call it? Scarborough. When you're coming up from, the creek and moving landward, you would see that gradient in vegetated plain elevation in each marsh unit, but it's aggregated over each unit. Yeah. And certainly, when you get to the planning stage where units have been identified, we have obviously the higher, the 1 meter resolution or higher elevation data to look more precisely at those gradients, with the caveat that, there's error because of the vegetation canopy.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it kind of depends on the resolution of the units, and you'll see that here when I dive into the layers, you'll be able to see what that might look like. So I'll make sure to show that.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Anybody else? Are we doing okay on time, Chris?
Yeah, you're good. You got plenty of time.
Okay. All right.
Neil, I had one more question. You
ahead.
also mentioned the elevation, the channel sediment budget, and just another project that's ongoing, there's an effort to look at interchanges, sea level rise and changes in intertidal mudflats in Maine. And one of the processes that has been suggested is that, especially for some of these southern Maine marshes, large storm events are mobilizing heavier, larger grain sediments from areas like Saco Bay and then pushing them up into the marshes. And so you get sand overwash in these channels. And I guess I'm just trying to think through the model that you've set up, and it seems like that would change the total volume in the marsh unit potentially by adding a sediment input that maybe never gets onto the marsh platform, but it's reducing the total amount of water that's available or moving through that marsh in each tidal cycle.
Yeah, so in the lifespan calculation, for example, we only really account for what sediment is above mean sea level. So if you have, let's say you have big sand waves coming up the channel, those are still subtidal, so not included in the actual mass. And again, the subtidal area is accounted for in, so yeah, so I mean, you're right. So basically that kind of contribution is not accounted for in any of this. And what we've seen, like at Ogunquit, what we saw is the movement of those sand waves into the channel are certainly a mechanism that's contributing to marsh resilience, because they're basically helping to maintain those flats, maintain the marsh edge, the marsh scarp and all that. So I would say by neglecting that, we're kind of going with a worst case scenario, because that is one thing that some of the Maine marshes have going for them, is that kind of sand import in the channels. But yeah, that's not going to be explicitly accounted for here. That's correct.
Yeah, Parker, go ahead.
Hey, thanks so much. Really looking forward to being able to play with the mapping tool and kind of explore it further. One question I had about, I suppose, boundaries. Is it easy enough to add layers that would allow some likely target audiences to be looking at, for example, just one watershed at a time, or one municipality or one county at a time? I'm thinking about, constraining the scale of information for some specific users that might have likely kind of physical boundaries that they're most interested in for the context of their decision making.
Yeah, I think I'm not an ARC expert. But I know how to make make a big mess in it. And it's relatively straightforward to get, bring in a boundary, municipal boundary, or a county boundary, or even a USGS hydrologic unit, and just clip the data to that boundary and ignore everything else. And that's something during the workshop we can certainly help individual users do with the data.
Thank you.
And Kate, I'm sure Kate realizes that I'm volunteering her to show me how to do that. All right, any other questions? This was just the teaser. Now the good stuff is coming. You all are going to be very excited about the rest of this. All right, so questions done. Okay, so I really appreciated the survey questions, and you folks all gave like very concrete action items, which made it really easy for me to kind of put these examples together. So I appreciate that. You're going to see locations that and that were in the spreadsheet, but please don't interpret it as me telling you anything about that site. Just had to pick examples for discussion. But here are the kind of the broad categories of what I read in your comments. So identifying strategies for marsh migration, prioritization, identifying restoration options, getting baseline conditions and evaluating success, and along those lines, metrics for restoration success, whether it's tier 1 or tier 2, and then lastly, identifying locations for sediment augmentation. So I'm going to pick a few examples you'll see that kind of address these, just to give you an idea, and then obviously welcome lots of feedback both today as well as between now and February. on whether any of this resonates or whether it doesn't, so I know where to go with this. All right, and a few caveats. So number one, these are hypothetical. Please act like you don't even know where these places are. Maine is really hard, as Kate will tell you. I think when we went into it, when we saw the square kilometers of marsh, we're like, oh, it'll be not too much work. But it turns out with such a scattered landscape of marshes, it's pretty hard. And I struggled working with these examples last night. It was really hard compared to like the Chesapeake, where you've got, acres of marsh all contiguous. You can really see some patterns, and in Maine, it's a lot harder. So this is good. This is a good test for us. So if we can succeed here, we can succeed anywhere. So thank you for that. Again, so these data are not the be all end all, and I don't think we ever intended them to be that. These are just a starting point. And what's nice is they're objective and consistent across, the region. So what somebody's doing in Maryland is being based on the same data set that folks are doing in Maine. This is where you can start. And then from here, you go on with deeper data layers and more intensive measurements. And you will always need more intensive observations once you identify site, and especially Phragmites, because again, the UVVR is going to tell you somewhere that, it's got complete vegetative cover, everything's just fine. But when you overlay your Phragmites map, if you have it, then that's going to give you a different suite of actions, right? So keep that in mind. And then lastly, I would encourage in this group between now and February and onwards, we should test this idea of bringing other data layers in, mapping them onto the units, and then doing decision matrices that have other variables on them, and see if that's informative. And so we can talk about that moving forward. All right, so first example, identifying strategies for aiding marsh migration. So again, you can see here the threshold has changed. Now it's 1.25 meters to represent the high elevation of Maine marshes. And so for this first example, this is going to be high elevation marsh units that have low UVVR. So nothing really to do other than make sure they're protected and make sure what is landward of them is possible migration space. All right, so here's an example. So these are the same image, just with different layers from our data set, which I'll be showing later. So here's the landward end of a marsh. You can see it here in just the imagery. On the right here is the UVVR mask. So in green are the vegetated areas, and in pink are the unvegetated areas. And then in the bottom left here is the decision matrix. So this matrix found several dark blue units. So we've got one, 2, 3, 4, there's like 8 or 9 units here in dark blue, all, landward of this bridge, save the one right here that's got some ponding, and you can see that in here. But the rest of these are high elevation, very much intact, long lifespan. So first question I would ask is Phragmites already there? And I'm judging by the imagery that it's not, but maybe it is. Now, if it is, then this is a whole different, this isn't a marsh migration question anymore. This is an eradication question. Second question would be, what's the slope at the marsh forest boundary? So here you would need to bring in either focused transects on the ground with RTK, or if, I don't know, certainly LiDAR might get you the slope of this area, moving up into this, this kind of unforested area, and maybe into some of these areas. But you would need on the ground transects of your slope boundary here to know whether these are reasonable parcels for migration. And then lastly, what is the ownership of these parcels? Is it conservation land? Is it private? Is it agricultural? What is it exactly? So already we've got 3 data layers that we need to bring into this to really make a concrete decision, but you've now got the first objective layer, which tells you these units are all high elevation, they're all laterally intact. So we have good opportunity here for intact marsh to migrate into forest with sea level rise. So then the question would be, if this is a place we want to act, can we get these data layers? What would it take to get the data? So that's one option. Now, the other marsh migration option is if you're in this other box where you've got high elevation of your vegetated marsh plain, but you have marsh units that are not intact. And so now you're concerned about even being able to have a marsh transgress into a coastal forest because it's not intact. So how will it do it? So here's another example from actually the same system, which shall remain unnamed, but of course you all know exactly where it is. And so now this set of units, and now this is, I think, this is about 5 units. These units are just seaward there, but you've got a lot of unvegetated area in pink, and that's what you're seeing here on the top right. High elevation still, so I think these marshes were still at 1.6, 1.7 meters of elevation, but UVVRs were above 0.3 or so, and you've got a lot of ponding, some of which may be natural, some of it might not be, right? So first question, are these naturally occurring ponds? I know in the northern latitudes, we get a lot of pond development, which have, ponds that have been there for hundreds of years. So the first question is, can we establish whether or not these ponds are existing features or are these recent degradation? And are they expanding? So if it's the former, if they are, well, I guess that should be the latter. If they're the latter, sorry, if they're expanding, what techniques are available? Would we want to do runnels here? Is there, are the ponds shallow enough that you could do revegetation by hand after they drain? Is thin layer an option at all? And in this case, what you could first do is check whether or not the restoration cost is worth the increase in lifespan. And with that, that's a segue for me to go to lifespan calculator. And so I've got a reminder here so I don't forget. So I'm going to stop sharing and go to the calculator. And this calculator is in the Chesapeake Bay paper that Chris shared. It is going to be online very shortly. And are you seeing a browser window, USGS? Yep, okay. This is the calculator. It is going to be publicly available online any day. We just need our last signature from the USGS, but it's been vetted and published. So what this is doing and what this will do down the line, hopefully in time for your use, is you'll actually be able to pull up the map of Maine, marsh units, click on the unit, get the information, and then it'll say calculate lifespan, and we'll pre-populate this entire spreadsheet with all the data. So I've done that for one of those units that we were just looking at. And this is the wrong one, it's this one. All right, are you seeing a UVVR 0.267? Yes?
Yep.
Yes,
Okay.
and if you could
Right.
zoom in a little bit, that might
Right.
help. I don't know if
I'm
you
gonna
can.
try that. Tell me if it's getting bigger. Yeah, okay, is that too big or is that okay? All right,
No, that's good.
okay. So this is the calculator. There's a little disclaimer here to explain what's going on. But when you click on it, it's going to populate this spreadsheet with the values from those units. So one of those units right in the middle of that unnamed place had a UVVR of 0.27, an area of about 350,000 square meters. And then obviously from that, we can calculate the unvegetated area from those two numbers. That's what this is. And there's the remaining vegetated area. So right there, you've got, and here's the thing we don't even talk about. Here are actual project numbers that you can actually use. So you don't have to go and map this yourself. It's been done. You now have an area of vegetation, unvegetation, which in itself hopefully would be of value. Okay. It will populate it with the elevation of the vegetated plain above mean sea level. So that unit was about 1.5 meters. Okay. It'll populate with the right location at some point. Sediment properties are defaults from the paper. If you have site-specific density numbers, you can put those in. I'm not going to do it right now. The sea level rise scenario I'm showing you right now is the dire 1 meter of global mean sea level rise by 2100. And that's downscaled using the NOAA predictions locally for Maine. And that's done automatically within our computations. So I've got that in here. And so that unit currently has a sea level has a lifespan of 203 years, which sounds like a lot, and it is a lot compared to Chesapeake Bay, but that's because you've got 1.5 meters of elevation capital. Chesapeake Bay, there's no marsh at 1.5 meters. The highest ones are at 0.5, 0.6. So you already have that going for you. So I would also caution to use these numbers in a relative fashion. So when you see a unit like this one that is struggling a little bit, know that, okay, so that's 200 is, borderline for us because, some of your marshes are 400, 500, whatever. Okay. So what we can talk about here, for example, is either thin layer or revegetation. So, or both, but let's talk about revegetation. So we know that we have an unvegetated area of 73,000 square meters. And let me just pull up what that is in acres, unless somebody really smart is on here. I'll pull my handy dandy calculator. So that's a lot of acres. That's too many square meters. Had a lot of zeros in there. All right, so that's 18 acres. So someone tell me what's a reasonable number for revegetating acreage? Somebody throw out a number they've heard before in a real project, if it's been done. Anyone? Otherwise, I'm going to go with half. I'm going to go with 9 acres, which I think is a lot, but 9? Okay, 9 it is. So if I go in here and I decide I'm going to do a revegetation project, and let's say we're going to do it by hand, maybe we're going to runnel, and we're going to assume that it's going to revegetate up to the rest of the marsh plain, for example, okay? So revegetation, and there's a little disclaimer here that says, okay, this is runnels, planting remediation. It explains where the numbers, where the calculation is going. I'm not going to really talk about that. So we're going to go with half, 9 acres, which is 35,000 square meters. I'm going to go ahead and say that, you know, I'm expecting some years from now, let's say 5 years from now, after we've done this planting, it's going to be fully revegetated at that half of that area, and it's going to accumulate enough material to be at about 1 meter above tide level. Let's say that we had measurements of the pond, and it was, let's say, 50 centimeters. The marsh is at 1.5, and we think it's going to come in somewhere between those two at 1 meter. So then I get a new unvegetated area. So we've cut that down from 73,000 down to 38,000. We have a new vegetated area. We have a new UVVR that went from 0.267 down to 0.12. We have a sediment mass that's added, because this is now trapping all that sediment below your new vegetated area, adding that into the account balance. And now we get 258 years from 203. So right there, you are getting a mass balance that's telling you we just got 55 years of life if we can revegetate half of the marsh parcel up to an elevation of 1 meter. So now the question is, can you actually revegetate 9 acres up to 1 meter of elevation from a half meter? And if you can, is it worth 55 years of time for this parcel? So we've given sort of at least a first cut at doing a cost benefit analysis. And what's nice is all of the assumptions that go in that calculation are transparent. They're all here. All the numbers are here. The other thing I'll show you is we have this other version, which is simply sea level rise only. So this is just water going up and down. It does not include the UVVR sediment budget relationship that is in the calculator. I like to think of this as giving some uncertainty bounds. So you can see that we had a range of 203 to 233 before the action. And with the action, we now have a range of 252 to 258. So you could speculate that that's giving you, uncertainty between 20 and 55 years of life for that action. So this gives you a kind of concrete way of doing that calculation. Any questions before I go back to the presentation? Yes, Sue.
Yeah. Hi, Neil. I'm glad I'm muted. Sorry. A couple of questions. One is, have you come across a place, or can you imagine a place that has, approaching an infinite lifespan? I mean, like a self-maintaining marsh?
Yes. I mean, well, certainly in Maine, you have some marshes that are, 1.8 or 2 meters above sea level with fully intact vegetation. Now, the question is, with sea level rise and just, lateral movement of the shore and the mud flat in the channel, obviously no marsh is going to last in place past some amount of lateral movement. And that's something we don't account for, right? So that would be something where you'd have to do a shoreline movement kind of calculation. But certainly, right, there is no infinite lifespan, given that our shorelines are going to move landward no matter what, and the marsh will have to move with it. So any marsh unit, as we've mapped it in place,
unless the marsh moves up.
Well, yeah, but that's not feasible.
I,
I mean, you're not going to have a marsh state in place with no lateral erosion for 1,000 years.
no, not for 1,000 years, but I think we're underestimating what the marshes can do in terms of vertical gain.
Well, I mean, they can gain vertically all they want, but if they're adjacent to a mudflat and a channel, they're going to end up in the water. And that boundary is going to continue to move landward with sea level rise and storms
Yes.
into the future. And so the distance that marsh unit might be from the channel or the mudflat is going to tell you how long it's got. If the limiting factor is not its own vertical growth and it can grow unlimited, then it's going to be that lateral piece. That will be the limiting factor.
Right. And so sort of a related question. Are you taking into account the contributions of below ground biomass?
Yeah, so
into this, and where does it come in terms of either, I'm sorry, going back to your 4-panel decision matrix or the lifespan calculation?
Yeah, so in the lifespan, the mass within the account balance is the bulk density that includes the organic matter. And then the sediment deficit, the sediment required to keep up with sea level rise includes an organic component. And it actually gives about a double benefit by adding half the mass back to it, assuming organic deposition. And that's from Jim Morris's synthesis of bulk density numbers. So the organic material is kind of accounted for twice, both in the substrate as well as the future deposition potential.
Okay, thanks.
All right, any more questions before I go on the next example? Chris, go ahead.
This is also not a trouble question, but this might be just like a dumb question. In this scenario, you have these like large pools that you're revegetated. I'm not quite sure I understand how that would prolong the lifespan of the marsh. Is that because it's trapping sediment, and then as the other surrounding marsh is drowning, it can cannibalize the sediment from that newly trapped? There's just extra budget of sediment in those unvegetated areas. Is that why?
You've got all of it. Yeah. So basically, there's two factors. One is by adding vegetation, you're reducing the UVVR. And so you're moving away from open water expansion. So you're reducing the sediment export. So that's one. The second is, in the assumptions of this method, anything that's below the vegetated plane gets added to the mass in that budget in your account balance. So prior, if you had an open water pond, any material that's above sea level in that pond is not getting included in the budget, in the balance. The minute you revegetate it, you've now locked it up. It's in the substrate, it's protected, it gets added back into the balance. So that's where the increase in life is coming from both the addition of that mass below the vegetation into the balance, and by reducing the UVVR, reducing the sediment export.
Okay, great. I guess a quick follow-up is, if you were to take a different approach and add, I guess it's all about sediment budget. So if you add, like, say, TLP over more acreage of the marsh that's vegetated, but it's like, wow, this is vegetated, but it's short form multiflora, let's increase it up 5 inches and add some elevation capital. The volume and mass of that elevation is which would be much larger than running those pools, and that would increase the lifespan by a lot more, I'm guessing.
That's right. So there's two ways to do that. So in here, if you click on revegetation, let's say what you just described is TLP followed by revegetation, right? So let's say you do TLP over half of that area, half of that unvegetated area, and you get that elevation up to 1.507 to where the rest of the vegetated plain is. Now you'll see that you got another 10 years, you got to 268. Now, if you do TLP only, and let's say your project completely fails and you get no revegetation, but you did a sediment addition. So let's say you did a sediment addition over 35,000 square meters. And let's say you added, a meter of sediment. and you put in the dry bulk density, and there's your mass added. Now, well, you got 264 because you added a ton of sediment, more than a ton, several tons of sediment. So you get 264 by putting an extra, because this is now this is actually a meter above mean sea level. So you've added a meter cap at 35,000 square meters at a very high density to the entire marsh plain. When you do it, and so that's the difference, and that's why those numbers are similar, is that here you're assuming this density of just sediment. When we did it with the revegetation, the density that's getting added is the density of marsh substrate, which is substantially lower than place sediment, right? So that's why those are slightly different. So you go 35,000 here, and let's say you're at let's say you're only at 1, so that same elevation before, you only get 258 instead of 262 because you've lost a little density, because now it's biological substrate. It's not sand with a density of 2650 and a porosity of 0.5. So, but these are all knobs that you all can play with, and I'm going to be glad to show you how to play with them so you can make some sense out of it. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. Is that okay? Or go ahead, Jacob, one more, and then we'll move on.
No, that's okay. I had several questions, so why don't you just keep going?
Okay. Well, we're going to show the calculator again, so you can, if it's calculator relevant, you can do that. And let's go back to where we were. All right, we're back to PowerPoint. All right.
Yep.
Okay, prioritizing marsh parcels for intervention and identifying restoration options. So now we're talking about more generally looking at a larger scale map, figuring out what to do and where. So these are going to be those two options on the right. And folks brought up some good points about the teal box, which I'm not talking about much today, but certainly for January, February, we can spend more time on that. Again, here's another marsh that shall remain nameless. I'm sure none of you know where it is. So here are some units right near the inlet that are popping up red. These are probably the largest evaluated parcels in this system, as far as I can tell. So the UVVR of these parcels, and there's several of them in here, there's maybe 10 units, well, 5 right here that are in red. So these have UVVRs about 0.25, relatively low elevation for Maine, 1.2 meters. Maybe a decent candidate for sediment placement if, for whatever reason, you're dredging these channels or you're dredging the inlet. It's very close by, right? But again, that's a value judgment and a feasibility judgment. Now, the interesting thing about these parcels is just adjacent to it, you have some restore parcels in beige. They're slightly higher, so they're like 1.4 meters. And they have slightly lower UVVRs. They're more at like 0.16, 0.17. And they're right next to a forested upland. So what's interesting, at least from a geomorphic point of view, is here you have a kind of a transect across a system that's behaving pretty normally. You've got a degrading marsh at the edge, you've got a slightly higher intact marsh a little landward, and then you've got a forest. So you've got this continuum of marsh forest that probably wants to move landward on its own, given no impediments. So it's an interesting contrast to this other example, more seaward in the complex, where you've got these obviously impounded areas with much higher UVVRs, but higher elevation. So they're showing up in the beige color. So, like this unit up in here, lots of impoundments. I'm assuming those are managed impoundments for waterfowl habitat, but I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. But of course, none of you know where this is. These units are landlocked between a couple of roads as well as development. So it's an interesting contrast. And again, this comes down to on the ground knowledge of what techniques are going to be allowed, what the zoning considerations are, what the land ownership is like. But you have a big contrast here. You've got a landward set of parcels that have a fair bit of anthropogenic pressure. And then you've got a seaward set of parcels that have substantially less anthropogenic pressure and proximity to the ocean, and likely ongoing erosive forces given their location. But again, now you have an objective way to compare these two areas and the individual parcels and decide what you have the stomach for and what you have the money for. I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to stop for questions in a second. So Let's keep going. Now we're going to talk about pre-restoration baseline conditions and evaluate restoration success, as well as metrics. So this is a tricky one because the fact is these data are only, static for when the imagery was taken, whether it was the 2018 imagery or the 2021 imagery, and you can't really use them for post-restoration success. You can certainly evaluate what you would get now in terms of lifespan. So again, here's a parcel, again, right next to that ocean boundary where you've got pretty degraded area. UVVR is well over 0.5 here. Elevation's pretty low. You can see quite a bit of perhaps natural ponding, but open water expansion and mudflat. Now, if you were doing a project in this marsh parcel and decided it was, close to a sediment source and a good priority given, its proximity to a stable parcel right here, as well as infrastructure, homes, certainly the first thing you needed to go out is do a more precise aerial survey, given the small area, get a precise UVVR with the drone, get precise elevations so you know what kind of lifespan and elevation capital you have. And then you can get a very precise calculation of that sediment mass and that UVVR and that lifespan. And then in order to actually track the performance, repeat surveys post-restoration of the UVVR as well as the elevation will then tell you whether or not you hit those targets and whether that lifespan is achievable. So again, here's an example which we can run through the calculator. This is going to be a sediment addition only example. So this would be one where, we've got sediment, let's say out in this inlet that's getting dredged, and somebody, the Corps, whoever says, we need to drop it somewhere. Can we drop it over here? And whoever runs this parcel says, yes, we'd be glad to take it. We're going to do the permits. And here's a parcel. So we're going to exit out again, and thank you, screen. Oh, good. Okay, so share again. All right, so now you should be seeing a different parcel with a UVVR 0.34. So this is that small parcel there. Again, quite small. It's only, so that other unit was what, 300,000 square meters. This one's only 20,000 square meters, very small unit. Again, you get your unvegetated area, your vegetated area, very low marsh. It's only the marsh plain's only 1 meter above sea level there. So compared to that other parcel, there's 1.5, we're at 1, so quite closer to sea level. And again, same sea level rise. So this one, we're just going to do a sediment addition under current status, 125 years. So again, for Maine, that's exceedingly low. So that's a very low lifespan. We can go in with a sediment addition. And what I've selected here is an addition area of 5,300 square meters. So I think that's half of the unvegetated area, if I remember correctly. No, I'm sorry, we're doing a sediment addition over the entire unvegetated area. So we're basically spraying a slurry into the whole unvegetated mudflat, 5,300 square meters, and we're going to try to add 0.5 meter. Again, density of sand at porosity of 0.5, so you get your mass added, and now you get 199 years. So you've added 75 years by doing a sediment placement, just by locking in. Well, you've added sediment into the balance, and as Chris said, this is basically providing a source for that cannibalization. So now, instead of sediment having to get sucked out of the marsh complex and eroded, you have this other pool of sediment that's contributing to the lifespan. And again, with the SLR only version, you get bounds. So you could say before action, our bounds were 125 to 149 years. After action, 199 to 237. So again, you get some uncertainty depending on which formulation you use. And this is with sediment addition only. Now, let's say you want to assume that that area gets revegetated. You can obviously go in here then, unclick addition, say revegetation, say it gets revegetated over that entire area. Let's say it revegetates just a little below the current marsh. And now you have, this is one of the flaws of the calculation is if the UVVR goes to 0, this number becomes uncalculatable, but you can use the other version, which is why we give it to you. So with revegetation now, with sea level rise, you're going to 174 years. And these are details we can talk about in the workshop. can also click need more info and it'll explain all that. All right. Stop sharing. We have one last example. Thank you for bearing with me. I know this is a lot. You're all wonderful. All right. Last example, sediment augmentation. Again, these are generic areas. I'm neither supporting nor against sediment placement as a federal employee. Do what you want, where you want. Okay. So from a general perspective, you can run through, the decision matrix and look in an area and look for red parcels. And that's going to tell you, okay, here are the ones that are in the worst shape. If we have sediment nearby, let's put some sediment on it, either raise the elevations on unvegetated areas or facilitate expansion of vegetation. So here are just a couple examples from places that will remain unnamed in Maine. Alternatively, if you're scoping more generally and looking for larger scale areas, you can just look at the UVVR and the unvegetated-vegetated matrix as we publish it. And so, for example, here's another area with lots of degradation, where if you had some kind of sediment operation going on and you're trying to help this marsh migrate into the forest and these other lands, good candidate given how high the UVVR is here. They're all well over 0.5 and quite susceptible to open water expansion and eventual loss. All right, so I will take the last round of questions before showing you how the data will actually look in ARC when we provide it to you in mid-January. So these data are preliminary. The final data won't be preliminary data with our final QA/QC. Finally published, which, Kate, correct me if I'm wrong, mid-year 2024 or sometime in 2024 is when that would be finally published, and then you can use it publicly and share it as needed. So with that, I will take questions before going into ARC and showing you the data. So Jacob, if you want to ask your questions you had now, or hopefully I answered them all and they weren't all about the lifespan calculator.
They were mostly about the lifespan calculator, so let's forget about it for now.
Are you sure? I think we have time, so
okay. Well,
I don't want to stop discussion. We have half an hour, so go ahead.
Okay, and I don't know if these are good questions or not, so you could just feel free to tell me.
Sure.
So the first question was, so the lifespan is being calculated for the individual marsh units, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so I'm just wondering, it seems like if one marsh unit is doing well, it's high elevation, and then the adjacent marsh unit is not doing well and it's going to degrade, all of a sudden you have, like, over this lifespan, you have a new edge where erosion could now be occurring and sediment could be exported out of that unit. So I guess my first question is the sediment, the overall sediment budget, it's not like for the estuary or for that whole area, it's just for those marsh units. So does the lifespan calculator account for what's going on in adjacent units? So that's one question.
Yep. So the answer to that would be no. So it'd be worst case scenario, when a marsh adjacent gets eroded, all of that sediment gets lost to the estuary, deposited in the channel, to be dredged by the Corps and then deposited upon your marsh at a later date.
Okay.
For example.
Okay. I mean, theoretically, it could also be adding to the marsh unit that you're interested in. So there's cannibalizing that's going on within the larger system, but this doesn't account for that.
That's correct.
Okay. And then the next question is related to the sea level rise rates. And again, this may be a dumb question, but I'm trying to imagine marsh conditions like 250 years from now. And I'm used to looking at the sea level rise rates, up to 2100, though I know that they project further out than that. Can you talk a little bit about how the sea level rise rates are incorporated into the calculator, and also specifically not only like how much sea level rise is going to occur over a certain time period, but also how the change in the rate of sea level rise is accounted for, because obviously as that rate increases, the accretion rates need to keep up in order for, it's not linear over time. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that is a consistent, complaint about the lifespan method, is that it doesn't do a time stepping through sea level rise scenarios. So one way to look at that is, let's say you want to account for changes, right? So you're saying, right, let's say right now Maine's getting 4.5 millimeters per year, and you want to then put in 6 20 years from now, and then you want to put in 8, and then and then 10 millimeters per year. You could do that, kind of time stepping on your own through it, like put in the calculation and then subtract out 20 years. That's clunky, and I don't know if it makes any sense. So I would say we should be, the goal of the lifespan calculator is to give you a present day snapshot of where you would be under that sea level rise scenario in 2100. So it's not going to answer the questions about the rate of change and the rate of loss. It's just giving you a relative metric in order to compare parcels under present day conditions and a future scenario that's applying to all of them equally. So by no means is it perfect, and by no means is it a model of future change. It's really a snapshot right now of how a marsh would fare under future conditions. So, I mean, what you're saying is absolutely correct, and it does none of that. So that's definitely a shortcoming, but what you're describing is really a time-dependent geomorphic model. And again, I would say that anyone who says they have one that can predict, marsh geomorphology for the next 100 years is being super ambitious and lots of uncertainty.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. Kristen?
Yeah, thanks. This is maybe a little bit off the topic of just the data you presented, but it was making me think about the value that everybody on this call can provide in terms of monitoring that they're already doing on some of these marshes. And of course, I don't know where they are that you showed, but I am monitoring in at least 2 of those marshes. And so my question is, if there were 1 or 2 pieces of information that we could add to these long-term monitoring sites, assuming everybody already has vegetation and elevation through our sets, do you have any suggestions on what they might be? I have some, rattling around in the back of my brain, but I'm wondering if you had thoughts on that.
I mean, I think bulk density and moisture content is probably a big one. Stem density, I guess stem density is what you mean by vegetation, right?
Well, where it's percent cover by species,
Yeah.
just looking at how plants communities are changing, but there is stem density for select species, at least for what I do.
Yeah, so I think, bulk density, below ground, above ground biomass, moisture content or some estimate of waterlogging. There's some literature out there now on microtopography and very subtle variations in elevation being kind of leading indicators of imminent marsh collapse. I don't think that that's something that happens in high latitude marshes so much, or at least not in marshes like Maine. I mean, I guess from my perspective, I would be very interested in knowing what the trajectory of some of the ponds are in terms of their elevation, the sub aqueous elevation of those ponds, which ones are known to be, antecedent, ponds that have been there for centuries versus those that might be more imminently created and expanding. So I guess some idea of what's going on in those ponds as well, at least in the ones where there might be a super high UVVR or proximity to a marsh migration corridor. Because that's an interesting question, is if you have a perfectly healthy marsh at 1.7 meters above mean sea level with high UVVR, but all the ponds are perfectly circular, naturally occurring, but you're right up against a marsh forest transition. With sea level rise, at some point you're going to pop open that pond, And the depth of that pond is going to dictate whether or not it's going to revegetate and allow for a nice transition up to the upland, or if it's going to convert to open water and now you have forest against water. But I mean, I know that's not, I mean, maybe that's something with drones that can be done. So I guess, you know, if the access to drones are there for individual projects to do some kind of selective tracking of things that you can do over larger spatial footprints, but not at this scale, maybe smaller scale on your individual marsh units.
Yeah.
What's going on with vegetation and pond growth.
And then what about sediment, like sediment traps at different spots on the marsh? Is that one that you would, just to look at what that sediment, one component of the sediment budget?
Yeah, I mean, 10 years ago, I would have said we need to measure sediment transport in every single marsh everywhere, but I mean, I know that that's not feasible. So, you know, if you have a well-channelized marsh that you're investigating, certainly, you know, some of the NERRS have turbidity sensors that are continuously, you know, monitored. So using those data to look at things like the flood ebb sediment differential, which is a straightforward calculation that we've published on, that can give you a relative idea of the sediment budget. I think that does a little better than traps because it'll integrate a larger space and give you a more holistic view of the channels, the flats, and the marsh plain. I think traps on the plain just don't tell you enough of the full story, especially when we know the channels and the mud flats are part of the story.
Okay. That's great. Thank you. And then finally, with the transition and slope, do you have a slope threshold in mind? I've read 3%, but I'm not sure if you have anything you've already thought of.
I mean, the data that Matt Kerwin and Grace Molino have published in the Chesapeake show that the thresholds are spatially variable dependent on other factors. And that's for the whole Chesapeake, which is obviously different than Maine. But I would assume in Maine, given your gradients in topography and sediment supply and, you know, upland characteristics, there might be variable slopes as well as elevation thresholds. But I would say look at some of those studies and see if there's a consensus in slope. I know there's not a consensus in threshold elevation at where marshes can transition. That's where it's spatially variable. I'm not sure about slope.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yep. All right. If we are good on time, I can go to showing you the layers in ARC, which are what we'll share with you down the line. So, and this is recorded, so that way, when you get the data, if you're confused about, you know, what files are what and what layers are what, you can go back and watch the recording as I step through it. I'll try to be coherent. And I appreciate you all staying with me for this long. I know it's a fire hose for all of us, including me. All right, where are you, ARC? Okay. Here's ARC. I hope is this visible, or do I need to, what do I need to do here to make this? Can you guys see what's going on? Okay. This is Maine, and you all know that. Okay. So we've got several layers here. The most basic ones are the CMU is conceptual marsh unit. Maine is ME is Maine, preliminary wet Mercator. These are just showing you the individual marsh units. So I'm going to turn this on. So the units are just arbitrarily colored. And so when you zoom in, you just get this nice individual marsh unit. So this helps you just see where the units are. Now, if you zoom in on one, for example, you know, this one here, in the light gray, you can see the delineation of marsh and open and unvegetated. That's hard to see with this. So what you can do is you'll get this other layer, which is just the unvegetated vegetated raster. So you click on that, and now you get the actual raster. Okay, so this is really useful just to kind of give yourself a little bearing when you're looking at your maps with unvegetated vegetated, so you can get some confidence in what's going on. But this really nicely shows you, for example, the impoundments and the features. And so you can, you know, click that off, zoom way in, and eventually you'll get the whatever the 6 centimeter imagery is. And you can click on that again, and you'll get, you know, your very precise UVV raster at 1 meter resolution. All right. So those are kind of the two most basic layers. So the marsh units and the unvegetated vegetated. I'll expand those just so you know what they are. All right. So then again, those are delineated using elevation data. And then with that elevation data, because we know where the vegetation is and where it isn't, we can calculate the elevation of just the vegetated plain or the entire unit, however we want to do it. Kate, remind me, is this the elevation of the plain, or this is the mean elevation of the entire unit, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so this is the elevation of the whole unit. So this is including areas that might be bare. It eliminates areas that might have what the USGS calls hydroflattening, where water gets kind of excluded. And you'll get that as a flag in the data. So here's the elevation. And again, they look like they're aggregated. They're not. It's just the color scale. But here's elevation. So lower in orange and higher in blue. So, you know, you can find some areas where you might see a really nice landward seaward progression. Some areas where you don't. Let's just see if there's something down at wells. Right, so here you see, you know, slightly lower units near the mouth and slightly higher as you move landward. So that's elevation. On any one of these, you can click on them and a window pops up in the wrong place. I'll get this to come out. There we go. Get this to show nicely for you. All right, so I just clicked on that unit. Where did that unit go? I'll click on it again. And so this gives you a marsh unit identifier, so that's a unique number. One of the reasons we're waiting to give you this data is these numbers will change. So we want to make sure we have the right numbers before we hand it to you. Gives you the total area in square meters, the vegetated area, the marsh unit elevation, and what's colored is that elevation, but then it gives you the vegetated plain elevation right here. So these values will almost always be higher because this is just the vegetated plain. So 1.5 meters. These are some elevation metrics suggested in some papers, the skewness, the lower third. We haven't used them to date. We haven't really gotten time to synthesize those or figure out if they're related to anything, but feel free to if you want. Polygon, length and area. Region, blah, blah. So that's all of the data for elevation. So I'll close that and click that. This is the UVVR. So again, same color scale as you saw before. I'm going to make these smaller, expand that. So again, you know, the green is good, pink is bad. So for example, we'll find some good ones, you know, like, well, we can go back to one of those unnamed marshes. So for example, you know, here's that unit, one of those units in pretty bad shape with the impoundments. And so when you pop that up, again, you get your ID, total area, vegetated area, your UVVR, so 0.5, very bad. A flag, the metadata will tell you what that flag means. It's probably related to the elevation data. So that gives you that. The lifespan. So right now I have this colored by the global sea level rise scenario of 1 meter by 2100. So when you click on that, these are color bars that we've established. You can obviously change these if you want to. So for example, here again, here's that unit with the UVVR of, actually this is a different unit. Let's click on the same one. Yeah, so here's that same unit, UVR 0.57. It's giving you a lifespan of 156 years under the 1 meter, under 5 millimeters per year, or the global of 50 centimeters by 2100, translates to 5 millimeters per year. It's giving you 220. This background value is not something you should use. That's like literally the background sea level rise rate that NOAA publishes. It's not relevant, but we have to use it. It gets subtracted out in our sea level rise calculation. And really the 3 millimeter per year is probably a foregone conclusion. So 5 and 10 are here. So that gives you lifespan. And then lastly, we will give you the decision matrix And again, this is with that arbitrary 1.25. When we have the workshop, Kate can show you how to code in any different value you want with a conditional statement. But then you get the nice decision matrix. And when you click on these, again, it gives you the UVVR, gives you the areas, the elevations, and the decision category, which in this case is decision 3, but they're just arbitrarily named and numbered. And then if there's no data, you get the gray color. And so that happens relatively infrequently, but there's some spots that have gray. So this will all be, so this is done right now. We're going to do a little more QA/QC and get you the ARC shapefiles and map packages sometime in mid to late January, so that you'll have time to look them over in time for the February in-person workshop. And I will stop there, but keep this open if there's direct questions about this or anything else. We still have 13 minutes. I don't know how much time you need, Chris, to close out.
Yeah, if there's, we will send out an evaluation. So if questions come up after right now, you'll have a chance to send them to the team, but go ahead, Kate.
I have just a quick question. When you talk about marsh lifespan, is that like any type of marsh, like vegetated salt marsh, and when it's dead, it's mudflat? I just was wondering what that marsh might look like.
Yeah, so the idea would be that if a marsh has a lifespan is kind of like you know, distance to a spot where you just keep moving halfway, like it never really gets to 0. And so the same goes for lifespan. You'll never get to, once it's a 0 lifespan, there's no marsh left at all. So what you're doing is, as you get closer and closer to 0, you're shrinking that marsh plain above sea level rise and cannibalizing whatever it was in the marsh plain to feed the rest of the complex that's subtidal. And so, yes, basically you're talking about conversion of vegetated salt marsh to subtidal mudflat. And what it's telling you is, like, let's say it's, you know, I can pick an example, and maybe that might be a good way to illustrate it. So let me find, well, I can find that one at here, right? Okay. So here's a parcel. I'll click on it just to get the number. So this is 125 years. It's got, it still has, you know, 15,000 square meters of vegetation relative to its 21,000 square meters of overall area. So it still has quite a bit of vegetated plain, but it's pretty low compared to the rest of the area, but it's still got a meter, right? So it's got 1 meter by 15,000 square meters of volume, right? And then we multiply that by density to get a mass. So what it's saying is that in 125 years, conceptually speaking, that's not the one I want. I want that one. All of this green area in this parcel is going to have to get scavenged to feed the pink area and keep it at its current elevation in order to keep up with sea level rise. So let's say that pink area in this channel right here is, you know, 10 centimeters below sea level. It's been, regardless of where it is, let's say it's 10 centimeters, it has to keep up with 10 millimeters per year of sea level rise. And that amount of sediment has to get cannibalized out of this marsh plain to feed that mud flat. And as it's feeding that, it's getting subtracted out of here, and that's getting lower and lower and lower until the whole thing is basically an unvegetated flat right at sea level. So conceptually, that's what's going on. Yeah, you're converting this whole thing to a mud flat across its entire area.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, and I have kind of a wrap-up question before I do the wrap-up. So the location of the data that we would have by late January, would it be for the whole state, Neil, or just southern Maine? So the parameters you gave, where will we have that for?
Kate, correct me if I'm wrong, but we are going to have it for the whole state in a preliminary fashion by mid to late January as a preliminary data product that you can't share, but you can have, and we'll put it on a server or email it or whatever. But and then when it's finalized, it will be published as one piece of data for the whole state with all the
Okay.
measures.
Good. All right. So then and again, if you guys have any questions, please ask as I'm kind of wrapping up. So we're looking, oh, go ahead, Jeremy.
Thanks for asking that question, Chris. That actually relates to the question that I had. So the marshes that we've been looking at here are all, salt marsh trending into brackish marsh. So does that statewide data set, does that also include some of the freshwater tidal marshes around Merry Meeting Bay? And is that included within sort of the conceptual model? Like, it looked like some of the other examples you showed us may have been along the Hudson earlier, where they've also got some. I'm just wondering if there's any words of caution for interpreting these data in lower salinity systems.
You still there? I just lost my entire screen. Everybody still there? Sorry.
Yep, we're here. Can you hear us?
Yeah. So Kate can tell you what precise NWI classes we used. Kate, can you recall that we did include some class that went further than estuarine emergent? Is that correct?
No, we really only use estuarine emergent from the NWI. We also use the MNAP, but even if MNAP was freshwater, we really didn't include it. I mean, we could look at specific areas, but that's our general rule of thumb.
Right.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jeremy. So what we'll do between now and late January, and we'll work on defining the actual case studies you guys want to work in and what partners you're going to work with. And we can ping Kate and Neil to make sure that when we get to late January, February, that the areas you want to work in for your case study are indeed included in the data. So we'll do that leading up to January. And that week in January, when we want to check in by webinar, will be, I hope, will be, we'd be looking at the layers one more time. You might give us a little review, Neil, and we'd have then a solid week. So factor in your week before the February workshop to play with the data that you'll get as early as, January 23rd. So you're not just going to show up in person February and be seeing this for the first time. So you'll have a virtual preview and it's cutting it close, but that's how long it takes. You heard how hard it is to work on the main data, but you would have that week leading into when we show up in person to play with the data. Is that right, Neil? That kind of scenario?
Yeah, Kate, did that sound like a reasonable time frame?
Yeah, I think that's what we had thought of.
Okay.
Okay, good. Good. So, and then I'll be sending out a survey and I'll put some other questions on that, that I'll be able to help you match up with partners, who wants to work on what. Based on the first survey, there's like 10 focus areas, putting some people listed the same areas. So we've got 10 areas that people would like to work on. It's not too late to add in the survey. So we'll do that online. And again, you guys have my contact info if you have any other questions. And on the survey, there's a place to put any questions you have for the team. The other question I have for you is on March 28th, the Maine Sustainability and Water Conference, I did a proposal for a session in the conference on Marshes for Maine's Future. And by November 30th, I just need to know if there's somebody from the group that would be a co-chair with me on this session. And then there'll be a call for abstracts. And if 4 of you would like to tell the story of the marshes you're working in, it doesn't have to be about this project. It can be anything related to Marshes for Maine's Future. So just send me an email and I can tell you more about that. But is there anybody right now who would volunteer to be my co-lead? They just want one other name from a different organization who's responsible for the Marshes for Maine's Future session. It's March 28th in Augusta. Anybody know for sure they do it? Okay, I'll just keep waiting to hear. And then I'll be sending out a few when to meets, like that week of January 22nd. I'll want to know which day of the week is the best. We can get the most people. So I'll send a when to meet, and that's the virtual meeting where we get the data to practice with and get ready for the February workshop. I'll also be sending out a when to meet for the influencer training, which is optional. That's for those of you that want to learn more about interacting with policymakers and making changes in marsh management that relate to the science. So I'll pick a date for that, and for the capstone, which I'm thinking will be in September. After, I don't want to interrupt anybody's field season. What are some thumbs up? Does anybody have thumbs up about that idea that the final capstone in September after Labor Day, rather than during the summer? Any ideas on that? Because I'm just going to propose some.
Yeah, from a fieldwork standpoint, Chris, it's still definitely the busy season, but
Right,
probably
and
better than August.
yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, because our grant ends September 30th. So we'll need to have the capstone, and we'll be working, you know, behind the scenes on getting other products ready for stakeholders. But yeah, September or earlier. So that's why it said September for that capstone. And we're going to invite a broad constituency to the capstone conference. You guys will be telling the story of you working with the data, but we want anyone important for marsh conservation and management to come in September. So the sooner we get a date and put it out there, so I'll be asking for feedback on that. So thank you guys so much. Thanks to Neil and Kate, who had to crank all this out in like 24 hours. I mean, I'm not kidding. They're amazing. Thank you so much. I'll provide more feedback earlier than 24 hours for the next one. And when you get the evaluation, it's not just an evaluation, it's for you to give us questions for what to do next. So thank you very much, and enjoy the holidays. You won't have any homework for this project other than Kate and Neil having homework to get ready for the week of January 22nd.